Hey everyone, I'm Rhea and I'm the lead editor at Farmore. Today I'm going to be breaking down how I approached editing our recent mini documentary, Village of Champions, which is about the legacy of high school football in Mogadore, Ohio. So we were approached by Sportsgrass, a synthetic turf company, about producing a short documentary about a football-crazed town called Mogadore in Northeast Ohio. So what made this place such an interesting subject was how central the high school football program was to this small town and how they've maintained this legacy and tradition of winning state and league championships. Many families there have generations of sons, fathers, grandfathers who've played, and there's so much pride and nostalgia around that for those families. We felt like that kind of small town pride and legacy was special and rare, so we were excited to take this project on. But you might be wondering what any of this has to do with synthetic turf. So in 2018, Mogadore decided to upgrade their grass field to a turf surface with the Sportsgrass product. So I find that with brand films like this, it's important to strike a balance between showcasing a product and telling a real emotional story. Yes, you do want the viewer to walk away at least slightly more interested in the product or the client's company, but not because they sat through a sales pitch. Hopefully viewers leave feeling like they understand how a product impacted someone's life or experience in a way that they can connect to and empathize with. I actually love it when I'm watching an ad that has such an interesting storyline and such compelling visuals that I forget it's an ad. And that's kind of how I tried to approach integrating the product into this story. So for any documentary project, it's imperative that you find the time to conduct a pre-interview with your subjects. You can establish rapport, you can ask questions that will lead to discoveries that could steer the edit. For example, we learned in a phone conversation about how a few years ago, the high school's athletic field house building was destroyed in a fire. The fire destroyed a lot of their athletic equipment, but it also ruined their irrigation system for their football field, which over time actually resulted in the decision to switch to a turf surface. We saw this not only as a dramatic story element, but as a way to organically introduce the client's product, which was ultimately the reason for the film in the first place. Once we got a handle on the characters and the intentions of the client, we pieced together a story arc before any shooting took place. We knew we wanted to create something compelling and cinematic that both spoke to the pride and legacy of Mogadore while promoting Sportsgrass. So after some initial conversations with people who would be participating in the film, we had enough information to form a loose story arc. And so we knew that we needed to do 5 things. Bring the viewer into the world of Mogadore, emphasize the history and legacy of the football program, introduce the current team and coach, reveal the fire and its consequential setbacks, and demonstrate how Sportsgrass aided in the continuation of this legacy. This is what we based our initial story arc around, and we actually brainstormed and drew out an actual storyline on a whiteboard. I took this outline and I made a post-it note version that I kept on the wall next to my desk for the majority of the edit. This was a living thing itself, and I was constantly adding, removing, and moving around these post-it notes, and this helped me keep track of how I should be structuring all this content. So just as critical as having a story outline to follow is having that North Star element. Now, what I mean by North Star is that one thing. It could be a phrase, a few words, a simple statement that make up the main purpose or goal of your project. It is your constant reminder of what this is supposed to be about and what it is not supposed to be about. This is something that you can return to every time you feel like you're losing your way in the edit, and it should help you realign your focus. For Village of Champions, I kept a post-it note stuck to my monitor so I could always refer to it. So this was just meant to guide me towards the main themes and ideas that we wanted to get across in this video. Over time, obviously, the edit morphed and changed, but this was something that I referred to constantly. I'm sure if you're watching this, you know that organization is critical when it comes to video editing, but that becomes even more important when you're working on a documentary project that involves days of footage, multiple interviews, music, all that jazz. So this was my project setup. You can see that I kept it pretty simple. I have my footage, audio, assets, and timelines. Now I want to get into how I approached organizing and familiarizing myself with our interview footage. Once my folder structure was created and all the footage was imported into its proper folder, I transcribed our interviews. We used Descript to transcribe all of our interviews. It's an incredibly useful tool that allows you to search through your interviews by any word or phrase. You can also highlight phrases with different colors and make notes. Once everything is transcribed, you're able to familiarize yourself with your subjects so much faster than watching the interviews all the way through. I want to make a note here that Descript, as far as I know, does not actually integrate within the Resolve interface, so you do have to use the program separately. As long as the video you've transcribed corresponds exactly with a timeline inside of Resolve, you can just use the timecode to locate a certain part of your interview. So I went and read through each of the interviews, making highlights of good quotes, certain topics, and anything else that stood out to me as a powerful or important line. So let's get into how I approached organizing and cutting down our interviews. So you'll see here that inside my timelines folder, I have a folder called Interview Utility. This is where I kept any working interview timelines that were not any kind of story assembly or rough cut. You'll see I have a folder for my multicam clips, interview cuts, and interview selects. And I'll get more into those in a bit. So first I created multicam clips out of each interview since we shot everything with a 2-camera setup. If you're not familiar with multicam clips, it basically allows you to combine 2 or more video angles into one single clip on the timeline, and you can easily switch between angles. Once I made multicam clips out of each interview, I duplicated these so that I would always have a set of unaltered multicam clips for safety. I like to have multiple versions of things so that I can always go back to a previous untouched version if I need to. After that, I created a sequence for each one I called interview cuts. This is where I made cuts, left markers, basically did things to the interviews that I wouldn't do to the original multicam timelines. From these timelines, I used Descript to help me locate good lines, and I pulled those into a separate timeline I made for each subject called the subject name selects. This is where I grouped sound bites by theme or subject, which I kept labeled by markers. So for example, if I knew I wanted to find John Adorney talking about how he felt about the Fieldhouse fire, I could locate that marker on the timeline and go through those lines. By the end of this process, I had a separate selects timeline for each interview subject. So it was extremely intimidating to try and wrangle all of this footage into a cohesive and compelling video. When you're working on something like this, you kind of just have to chip away at it day by day, and eventually something that you can start to get excited about starts to emerge. So I started by creating what I call story assemblies, and these were just meant to be the roughest outline of the story. Nothing is meant to sound good or look pretty, it's just pulling the pieces together to form a loose string of ideas. I pulled from those interview selects timelines I made to create the general groups of subject matter, and you'll see here on the timeline how I divided each topic by marker and labeled them as such so I could easily just hover my mouse over it and see what it was supposed to be. I laid this out in the general order that I thought the video should follow based on our story arc, and my first story assembly was actually over an hour long. Now, we knew that we were aiming for a total runtime of about 7 to 10 minutes, so clearly I had my work cut out for me. Once the timeline started to phase out of the story assembly mode and take on the shape of a rough cut, I started placing those sequences into a separate folder I named Rough Cuts, and just did the same thing, except here is where I started to add B-roll, added some music, some photos, some archival footage. It was a struggle to delete certain lines and moments, but ultimately you're digging for the information that is the most concise, emotional, and compelling, and not everything is going to fit that bill. And this is where that North Star really comes in. You can refer to that when you're on the fence about whether or not a line or a moment or a scene belongs. Once those roughs started to take on the shape of something close to what we could show the client, I started placing those timelines inside of a cuts folder. And these timelines were starting to have a little bit of initial color work done, a little bit of sound mixing, and just overall they were becoming more and more polished. So there are probably an infinite number number of ways that you can approach organizing and cutting down your documentary interviews. This is just the method that worked for me. I think as long as you stay organized and keep a non-destructive editing workflow in mind, meaning that you're preserving every single stage of your work so that you can always go back, whatever processes you adapt will work for you. So again, there are probably 100 different ways you can approach this, but I prefer to keep all of my B-roll selects on one single timeline loosely in chronological order. You'll see that I used markers to label each group or scene or theme of B-roll footage. These blue markers represent a new scene. These purple markers represent a practice or gameplay. And that one green marker is for any footage of the football field and the turf grass. Now, this may look a little chaotic to some, but it was pretty easy for me to just scroll through and find the scene I was looking for. You can even click Index up in the left corner of Resolve, click Markers, and there you have all your markers in order, and just double click and it'll take your playhead right there. Let's dive into how we created a compelling story. We spent a lot of time thinking about how we could take the viewer on a journey, because making a brand film about turf grass probably doesn't sound the most intriguing right off the bat. So once we had an idea of our characters and the way we were going to construct this story, I focused on shaping the edit in a way that would get the viewer to care about the people in this town and the success of the football team. Because if the viewer doesn't care about those two things, they are not going to care about the fire, they're not going to care about the new field and what the field means to the town and so on. So it's good to ask yourself, what are the stakes? In the world of my film, what is of value to the characters, and what will happen if it's not achieved, if it's not obtained or maintained? The idea that I was trying to pose in the edit was, what would Mogador be without football? I also tried to be intentional with creating highs and lows in a way that would keep the viewer engaged at every moment. So I'll talk about a few moments in particular, starting with the intro. I started the doc with this loud and slightly chaotic intro, only to go immediately into a scene that shows the quaintness of everyday life in this small northeastern town. We really wanted to grab the viewer and then kind of pull the rug out from under them to really hook you in the beginning. It goes without saying, but music is a very important tool for eliciting feelings from the audience, and you want that to be organic. And music really helped underscore certain feelings and moments in this edit, like using a more aggressive song to create this sense of hype and toughness around the football team itself, even if it was just a practice scene.
Since '79, we've had 3 head coaches.
And creating this sense of togetherness and community with a slower, more heartwarming song.
Those of us that love Mogador bleed Mogador green. It's a saying, but it's true.
Only to juxtapose that moment with a somber and ambient song when we get into the Fieldhouse fire.
You know, the Fieldhouse was donated by 5, 6, 7 people. You know, they built that by hand, and it meant a lot to people.
We couldn't believe our
Music
eyes.
was a critical component of moving from scene to scene and informing the viewer of how the story is moving along. But I want to add here that while working on this edit, I found that just fading in and out from song to song wasn't exactly the strongest storytelling device for transitioning from scene to scene. I think that carrying the viewer from scene to scene needs to be as natural as possible, unless your intention is to be jarring. So a good workaround for this was using nat sound moments to help move from one scene to the next, like using a whistle over footage of the inside of the restaurant to indicate that we're going into a practice scene now, or hearing the sound of a fire truck before we see anything that indicates that there's a fire, to kind of create suspense and lead you into the oncoming moment. So it wouldn't be a real breakdown if I didn't talk about some of the hurdles around this edit. Just from a post-production standpoint, it took about 5 weeks total from first offloading the footage to creating a cut that we sent to client. And that's not including additional time for the final sound mix and color grade. To be a good editor, you have to have good mental endurance because this kind of work is tedious. It's repetitive and it can be monotonous, you know, looking at the same footage, listening to the same interviews day in and day out. And I want to talk about the revision process. So the first thing I showed Lance, our creative director, was a story assembly that was 17 minutes long. From there, we met up once or twice a week so he could watch where the edit was at and give me feedback about what was working and what wasn't. As the assemblies became roughs and the roughs became cuts, Luke joined our meetings and gave feedback as well. These discussions ranged from this song isn't working here or that scene transition was really rough to take this entire section out. So it really was a collaborative effort to shape this into something that we could all be proud of. There were definitely things we didn't agree on. You really have to take yourself out of it and think what is best for the video in terms of making it something that is visually and emotionally captivating in every way. More often than not, real, honest feedback is what takes the video to the next level. So this one is a bit more of an existential challenge, one that I know every editor is familiar with, and it's that moment of, oh my god, what even is this? What is the point of this video? Will anyone even watch this? And you feel like it's never gonna get finished, and even if it does, it's gonna be a total flop anyway. We have all been there, right? So this project was no different for me. There were plenty of days where I had no idea how or even if it was gonna get done. It's very cliche, but I wanted to close this video by saying that in a documentary, you will feel lost in the edit. You will wonder if any of it makes sense. You will wish you had never even agreed to work on this project. But one thing I can promise is that the story will reveal itself to you and something cohesive will start to come through if you are intentional about the journey that you're trying to take the viewer on and you're striving to represent your subjects in an honest way. Focus on that clarity and joy you feel in those moments when you watch something back and you feel in your gut that it's working. So if you've made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Leave a comment if you have any questions about editing branded documentary content.